Alright, okay. Oh shit. Oh, fuck's sake. Oh, right. How are we all doing? I know I'm a little bit late. Sorry, guys. How are we all doing? Hope we're all having a fantastic morning, afternoon, evening, night, wherever we are. In the chat yet? No. Anyone on YouTube? Let's see. Doesn't appear so yet. Okay, alright then. Alright, oh, there we are. Anyone here? Anyone here? Anybody hear me? Anybody feel me? Anybody? Whatever the next lyric is. Anybody out there? Hope we're all doing well, guys. Gonna get straight into it. If in the next couple of minutes or so, I'm aware that I tend to go quite long with these streams. It's not always the most popular, so we'll try and keep it fairly short. Ian, my man, how you doing? Hope we're all doing good. Hope we're all doing good. Okay, right. There we go. Get the chat just over here so I can see it. Boom. All right. So those of you who would have seen the stuff of what we're going through before, would already know the conversation that we're going to be going through. I thought it'd be important to highlight it, because especially from a political perspective, in the UK, especially speaking from a nationalist perspective, it's one of the hottest topics. It's one of the premier sources of what people point to highlight pretty much where everything started to go wrong, pretty much, which is Windrush. Now, I'm not an expert historian. That's why I wanted to highlight a conversation with one. Which we're going through in full. David Starkey. And this conversation is titled The Lies of Multiculturalism, in particular the Windrush myth. So Windrush, for those of you who don't know, and I'll keep this nice and short because obviously I'm not an expert in the subject matter, but is basically the name of the ship that brought the first waves of Caribbean and migrants from other areas of the world. And it wasn't long after that opinion against immigration, particularly to the UK, massively changed. There was, I believe, 1 or 2 riots that took place in several areas in England. They started arriving, if I'm not mistaken, the veneer of what the reason was given was to make up labour shortages from the war, right? And not long after they started arriving, in the late sort of 50s, mid to late 50s, opinion, from what I understand, massively changed towards immigration. The stats that I've seen is that you had about 81.5% of people in London voting in favour of immigration control. So that's just over 4 in 5 people voting in favour of immigration controls, i.e. massively controlling it or reducing it or stopping it entirely. And nationally, you had about, I believe it was about 73%, from what I understand, changing at that time. Very, very quickly, opinion against immigration changed. That is why one of the biggest grievances with regards to immigration is Windrush, because ever since then, you can argue that the biggest betrayal of the British people had started. So that's why many people get, very emotional when it comes to Windrush, or when the conversation around immigration often goes back to that time. Many people would argue that that was the first... Oh, sorry, ladies and gentlemen. I think my microphone cut out briefly there. First biggest time where the British government essentially gave the finger to its people, and has been giving the finger to its people with regards to this issue ever since. And that's why it is such a big area of discourse and area of discussion today. That is my basic understanding of it, right? And that's been spun into this massive myth that We put out the call, i.e. the British put out the call, and these migrants, these heroic migrants, answered it. That's been the big lie that's been spun from Windrush, unfortunately, and that's been the impetus then to drive more immigration, think about the quote-unquote rich history of immigration, all of these things, panders into other narratives then like diversity built Britain, even then, you know, people profiting off of the ideas of the first Black Britain, which if you saw my episode that came out today on YouTube, it came out yesterday on Rumble, we literally went over how DNA evidence has now completely blown that myth out of the water, almost like a bit of an early Christmas present, if you want to think about false narratives around British history being blown right out of the water. But without further ado, just check to see who else is here. Maybe people can join as we go, so I don't want to leave it too long because I don't want this stream to run for too long. We'll get straight into the conversation. We'll start the conversation from about a minute and a half in, only because it just goes through intros and stuff like that. So there's no real need to go through, you know, the intros and everything like that. You can go watch the intro to the video if you want. But the biggest chapters in this, we're going to go over things like David Starkey on the lies of multiculturalism. He even goes over Labour's disastrous budget. Apparently there's this new thing called the Paresh report. So I've watched this conversation, I think, once or twice. But I wanted to go into it relatively fresh, just so we can have a relatively raw, if you will, conversation about it in the chat as well, hopefully. Hate crimes is social engineering, and a bunch of other things as well. So without further ado, we'll get straight into what we're going to be going through. I hope you guys enjoy it. Obviously, if you're watching this in the watch back a little bit later on, then obviously you'll be able to skip to the relevant section that you want. But yeah, thank you everyone, to everyone that's here with me so far. And yeah, I just hope you enjoy. So let's get straight into the first part of the conversation here. Let's bring it over. Here we go. Just to double check, guys, just going to do a quick sound test to make sure you can hear it.
Okay, so on that key issue of post-truth, the question we were getting into last time was, of course, the noble...
If you heard that bit, just put like a thumbs up or something in the chat, just so I know that it came through. Okay. Just so I know that it came through. Where is it? Okay, Rumble doesn't want to bring up the chat for some reason. What about this chat? If anybody is here, if you can just let me know if that came through okay, just with something in the chat. It came through okay on my levels, but obviously I don't necessarily hear exactly what you guys hear. If I don't get anything in the next sort of couple of seconds or so, though, we'll just crack on. And I'll assume my levels are okay. Came through? Awesome. Thank you very much. All right. Let's bring it back to the start of that. Let's get straight into it then. Hope you guys enjoy. Let's go.
Okay, so on that key issue of post-truth, the question we were getting into last time was, of course, the noble lie, and in particular in the story of race relations in Britain over many years. And this was in particular related to the grooming gangs, but I think there are quite a lot of noble lies and half-truths about that story and the history of race relations that we could get into. But let's start with the Stephen Lawrence murder, and in particular the Macpherson inquiry that occurred after that. Because, of course, well, this was a horrible murder, that's for sure, but almost every other aspect of that, there's been a lot of politics involved in manipulating the truth. So, for instance, to start right at the beginning, it's not actually certain that it was a racist murder. I mean, these were very nasty men, it's clear, but they had, for instance, murdered white people before. They were a very violent gang. Then it's also not clear that the fact that the police were initially unable to convict the killers was down to racism, which was, of course, afterwards alleged. And various other elements of this have been woven into this narrative about the deeply racist British society, and indeed in particular the institutionally racist police. That, of course, occurred in the Macpherson report in 1999. The murder was under a Conservative government in 1992, but this was taken up really in earnest as a social crusade by New Labour from 1997. And I'll leave you with the words of Jack Straw, the then Home Secretary, who really pushed that crusade, which were, "I want the murder to act as a catalyst for permanent and irrevocable change, not just across our public services, but across the whole of society."
I'm going to pause it there a moment. So to give just a little bit of context for those who may not be aware, this is from the Crown Prosecution Service itself. I'm just reading this off my phone. It's not actually on the screen. Remembering Stephen Lawrence 30 years on. So this was a allegation that this young black man, Stephen Lawrence, on the I believe he said 1992, but on the 22nd of April 1993, he was an innocent young black man, was brutally murdered by a group of white teenagers in southeast London. We all know him as Stephen Lawrence, and his name has rightly endured over all this time. His death shocked the nation, first because of the unprovoked and racially motivated nature of the crime, and later because of the way in which the criminal justice system failed Stephen and his family. Now, we're already getting into here now the explanation, that the wider sort of discourse around this is what David is going to go into in a moment. We're already seeing here some doubts that are cast on this narrative, particularly because this gang of teenagers, if what the presenter here, I believe his name is Laurie, if I'm not mistaken, I've forgotten his name off the top of my head, said that this gang had been going around and attacking whites as well. So it just seemed that it was a gang of hooligans that in this instance went across and murdered somebody, but they've been, attacking other people of all other races in the past, or particular whites in the past. Well, might cast major doubt on the specific racism narrative, which obviously has been run with for a long time. Whenever you see anything to do with this now, the one guy, I can't remember his name, he led police on this massive chase, but a bunch of lives in danger, and then when he refused to surrender, the police ended up shooting him, and Black Lives Matter ran with it. It was like the British equivalent of like the George Floyd thing. I've forgotten his name. Whenever there is an incident of black crime, even if it's black on black, a lot of the time it's British society that's at fault. It's institutional or societal systemic racism that's at fault. And as Pierre Many says, it doesn't appear to be so. And it's this narrative that in many ways you don't actually have to have a specific instance of racism to run with, as David will explain. Has been used to push a lot of these agendas, diversity, and obviously then you had Tony Blair saying you need to rub the right's nose in diversity, wage war on the forces of conservatism. Really, really destructive narrative has been waged off the back of this, and that's where it's said here with this quote on the screen, which I think is quite useful. I want the murder to act as a catalyst for permanent and irrevocable change, not just across our public services, but across the whole of society, regardless of if it was actually a racially motivated murder or not. You can see Labour here, in this instance, wanted to use this to enact these changes on British society. There was always a wider political angle with regards to these things. So I think that's just important to point out there. For those of you who don't know, this happened 30 years ago, according to the CPS, 22nd of April 1993. They've alleged it was racially motivated. It does appear that there's more to the story, which we'll get into now.
And yet, in many ways, David, the change that was built on was based on a false narrative.
Yes, I mean, I think it's important to pull out the key ideas here. I think and again, to look at the Macpherson inquiry itself. When you look at the Macpherson inquiry, it looks as though it should be the most establishment thing in the world. It is chaired by a distinguished Scottish judge, Sir William Macpherson of that ilk sort of thing. But the key figure in it was an agitator, a priest agitator, John Sentamu, who becomes the Archbishop of York, who was, before he was a priest, he was a lawyer. And
one last pause. So before he gets into this bit, this part is extremely important, right? Seeing this agitation right from the very beginning, it would seem. David Starkey himself is, for those of you who don't know, an English historian, radio and television presenter. This is just from his Wikipedia bio. So again, take this with, grain of salt or whatever, just to give you a background on who this guy is. And he describes his views as conservative. The only, well, actually, that's not so much important. Where is his actually, I believe, according to Wikipedia, at least he went to Fitzwilliam College, Cambridge, where he done his bachelor's and PhD. I'm just trying to work out what exactly his main field of study was. So here we go, early years and education. I just want to give you guys a little bit of a background on who he is. So he had a scholarship to enable his entry into Fitzwilliam College in Cambridge. He gained a first-class degree, a PhD and a fellowship, and he seems to be more so around Tudor history. Being supervised by Professor Sir Geoffrey Elton, an expert on the Tudor period, but has since obviously then spoken out on more politically charged topics. He's been labelled as far-right Nazi, all of these things himself as well.
it is largely him. I remember debating this. It started to emerge, particularly, as you said, through the 1990s when I was heavily involved in the moral maze, and it was one of the frequent topics of discussion. And we focused on this man, on the invention of, and it is an invention, of the idea of institutional racism. This thing that means that entire bodies, or indeed the whole of British society, because what effectively happened was that the problems with the Metropolitan Police were turned into a kind of analogy or a metaphor for the whole of Britain. And you have this idea of institutional racism. And the wonderful thing, Laurie, about institutional racism is you don't actually need to have an individual who is racist or a specific act who is racist. In other words, the idea is entirely separable from any demonstrable fact. As you pointed out, the facts are and were and remain intensely in dispute. It's also very striking, it seems to me, that the convictions that were finally brought about, remember, above all, this again is very extraordinary, by direct pressure from the Daily Mail under Paul Dacre, and effectively breaking every rule of evidence and every rule of presuming innocence before guilt, with deliberate entrapment of the suspects, of the use of any serious lawyer would have thought was pretty dubiously extracted evidence, and so on. Nevertheless, this entire narrative was constructed.
Going about narrative construction, think of how well these things would have aged if you said them at the time now. Now, you've had David Lammy going into the position of, I believe it is either Justice Secretary as well as the Deputy Prime Minister of the United Kingdom at the moment, and he's now doing away with jury trials, and we're trending in this massively communist direction. You can see that... presumption, things like innocence until proven guilty is rapidly being done away with. So a little bit of information as well for you guys on John Sentamu. He was appointed the Archbishop of York in 2005, becoming England's first black archbishop. He was born into the Buffalo clan near Kampala in Uganda. He was the sixth of 13 children. And in 1974, his criticism, this is just according to the National Portrait Gallery, by the way, in 1974, his criticism of Idi Amin's regime for human rights violations led to Sentamu's arrest and his departure for Britain. He was trained for the priesthood in England, and he was ordained as a priest in 1979, was made Bishop of Stepney in 1996 and Bishop of Birmingham in 2002. He was indeed an advisor to the inquiry into the death of Stephen Lawrence and the chairman of the Damalola Taylor murder investigation review. As Archbishop of York, he is the second most senior cleric in the Church of England, has been active on issues including young people and family, modern slavery, poverty in the UK, and international injustice and conflict, setting up a charity called the Archbishop of York Youth Trust charity, followed by the website Acts 435 that enable charitable giving in 435. He appears to have been, again, an agitator in this, and like we see, I covered this actually when we were talking about the first Black Britain myth earlier on in the podcast today. There's been several people that have used things like this, use these narratives based on dubious facts, based on facts that are not clear at the time, based on motivations attributed to people that they may actually not have, to push agendas. And all of our public institutions have only been too keen to go along with it. So you saw that with the first Black Britain, David Olusoga's documentary series on it, labeled her as the first Black Britain. They had this expert archaeologist by the name of Joe Seaman, said that at the time this would have made her the first Black Britain. Taking all of this as fact, and then DNA analysis, right, the best tools that we have now. Back when this body was first alleged to have been discovered around the 1950s, we don't have an official date of excavation or the archaeological dig for when this body was discovered or whatever. There's no official time frame. It's thought to be around the 1950s. There was, you could say that around that time, things like the techniques that we have today are not as developed as they are today. So you could excuse some misfindings, if you will. And science doesn't proceed in a linear straight line. It does wind and it does go in different patterns, and you find things out, different things along the way. But we've seen how they've been used to push political agendas. So that's why we should be viewing things with a lot more scrutiny. Even just, the party wants you to disbelieve that you're lying eyes and ears. Don't do it. Most people have pretty good instincts. They might not be 100% correct on the money in all things. But again, if you're seeing something, and again, you possess, basic logical faculties, they're not going to lead you far wrong. And as long as you're acting in good faith and pursuing knowledge and pursuing truth, you will get to whatever the truth is. And that's the most important thing. That's the most important thing. The reason why people are so angry in large part is because how much they've been lied to, right? Because of how much they've been lied to. So many myths, truths about history, which is why it's important to correct the record.
Which is independent of fact. In other words, it is manipulable in exactly the same kind of way that Jack Straw spoke about. And this seems to me to be fundamentally and profoundly damaging. What it says is, as is also this notion of irrevocable change, that the idea that we have politicians who see themselves as almost artists, that society is a raw material to be reworked, reshaped into a kind of artistic vision they have. Do you know who were the last lot of politicians who spoke like this? The Hitlers of this world. They were, if you look at it, Hitler is a failed artist. The
Interesting
very
comparison.
close association between him and people like Albert Speer, the architect responsible for the redesigning of Berlin as the capital of the 1,000-year Reich and whatever. And it is this.
Maybe the lesson from this is to take painters more seriously.
Extraordinary notion of the remolding of society by an act of political will, combined, of course, with propaganda, because that's what we're talking about. We are talking about your noble lie now, used exactly as Plato imagines in the Republic, to communicate an idea of an ideal and idealized society, to mold reality into the desired objective. And interestingly enough, in the Republic, and it's why it has always seemed to me that we should still focus in all our work on politics on those two key texts of Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Politics. In the Republic, the central section is on the role of the political unreality. It's the myth of the cave, in
this
which
bit's important.
you have the group of citizens imprisoned in a darkened room who've never seen anything outside it. And what it really is, it's an image of the internet. It is completely extraordinary how 2,500 years ago, present unreality was anticipated, because he imagines manipulated puppets with a fire casting enlarged images on a white wall, and people only familiar with that. And we are in this profoundly dangerous world, it seems to me, in which right, left, and center have all conspired with Plato for often good reasons, sometimes very bad, sometimes in the middle, to ignore reality, to pretend reality doesn't exist. Let's look at
Right, I'm going to pause him there. I was waiting for him to finish. I was like, for God's sake, David, finish your statement a minute. Right, because I want to bring this up. He just described there something that's really interesting, that's often described when you're talking about Plato, the allegory of the cave. So this is a construct that Plato imagined, and I'll bring this image up on screen because I think it's important to see exactly what he's referring to. If you're familiar with the allegory of the cave, you'll already be familiar with an image like this. So this is Plato's allegory of the cave, and that's what he's describing here. You will have spoken with people in your life, no doubt about it. I do all the time, who only get the news and everything from mainstream media, who you will talk to, and they will be like people in this cave. So on the bottom left, which you can see, there's if I just move my cursor out the way, there we are. So in the bottom left, in fact, I will use my cursor actually to denote it. You'll see here, these are the people that are trapped in this cave behind this wall that is, seemingly insurmountable. And they're being shown this show on the wall of the cave with these different puppets or with these different, structures, which you can see here, that are being manipulated by these hooded figures. Again, use that to, analogize to the levers that are being pulled by the mainstream media, the hooded figures that you never see that are controlling the world. People have different conspiracies about who those people are, should we say. But regardless, this is definitely what's going on, particularly if you only get your news information from one source. This is like your mainstream media showing you a particular narrative that you will not question unless you have reason to. This is truth. This is truth for these people at the bottom of the cave. It's all they know, right? And as a result, they will 110% likely believe it that it to be true. However, you will get those people that are a little bit discordant, right? That are a little bit, they sing a little bit differently in the choir. They're a little bit off key. They might actually question, being like, what else is out there? They be these people down here, they don't question anything that's out there. They just sit in front of their TV. They let the BBC or ITV or Channel 4 news anchor give them all of their information all the time, and they take that as gospel. Yet the other people then that will actually stand up, look around and think, what else is going on? And they'll actually see then, oh shit, I'm actually being fed a deliberate show of these things. And actually there's an exit to this cave. And when you climb out, it's like, oh my God, this is a whole other big world out there. This is independent media. This is independent media, right? This big diaspora of all different people saying all different things. Now, for the people in this instance, the little hooded figures down here, this idea of people getting out of the cave is extremely scary. Independent thought, escaping exactly what they want you to believe and what they want you to see, is extremely dangerous. Why do you think they're trying to censor Elon Musk and X so much? Why do you think they're trying to clamp down on podcasters or people that put out different viewpoints on social media? All of these things, right? But in particular, the mainstream, the big media organizations. That's why they go after big people of influence: Elon Musk, Donald Trump, Nigel Farage. These people, right? You're gonna have your disagreements with them, but what they try to do is they try to close off this hole. They try to close off this hole to stop people from going there. That's censorship, right? That's censorship. That's like the EU legislation where they're allowing police to go in and monitor your private communications. That's what they've done with Pavel Durov. That's all of this stuff, right? You can see why people get into the thought patterns that they do, how easy it is to get caught in these politically correct thought patterns and this politically correct orthodoxy when you're stuck at the bottom of the cave. Sadly, that's what it is, especially with a lot of the older generation and some of the people that I talk to. They only get their news from one source. They grew up on BBC. That's all they had for their entire life, right? They've got 40, 50, 60 or more years of trust with these organizations, right? That to even question this, you'll be perceived as exactly everything they warned you about. To even question it, you'll be perceived as a Nazi and all these things, a thought criminal, right? You can see how easy it is to get caught in these things. And when they start spinning myths about Windrush, about all of this history, when they start rewriting history, these people are powerless. These people are powerless to be able to detect that, and they will instantly then go into thinking that was always true. You know, the people in Airstrip 1 in 1984, where they the party goes back and rewrites the old newspapers, and as a result then they end up not even able to question it, right? Not to mention being distracted by football and the pubs and all these other things, which when you go down into the prole areas of the book, you start seeing what the actual civilization down there is really like. They don't really care so much about what's going on down there. They distract you with football, they distract you with all other vices, right? And the pub and everything. The pub is great, don't get me wrong, pub is great, but people getting so distracted and so pissed off by things like football and stuff like that and not actually caring about the wider political landscape is, again, also indicative of the problem. But, they will go back and rewrite things. They'll change the puppets, and these people down here will be none the wiser and able to detect it. And as a result, then the party's able to act with complete impunity. They've got control of the past, which is control then of the future. It's why it's so dangerous. This is why they think independent media is so threatening. And it's why I thank you all for tuning into this stream and tuning into the podcast and everything like that. The British podcast scene at the moment is massively underdeveloped and underutilized. So hopefully we'll be able to change that going forward. Obviously, then the British state and all the minor states going to have things to say about that. But that allegory of the cave is extremely important to dial down on. It's one of Plato's philosophical concepts. Have not read The Republic yet. I have not finished it. Anyway, I started reading it, but I'm one of these people. I'll go and read something, right? I'll read something and I'll get like a couple of pages in, and then I'll go and try and read something else because I want to try and I'll watch a podcast or I'll listen to an interview and they describe this book. I'm like, right, I want to go get that book, and I'll read like a couple of pages, but then I'll listen to another one and then they'll be talking about this book and I go and read that. I start a lot of books and I don't finish them, is my point that I'm making. So that's why when I'm doing Animal Farm at the moment, I'm religiously on Animal Farm until I do my video on it, and then I'll move on to something else. But we're living in Animal Farm at the moment. It's hinted in Animal Farm as well. When the pigs go back and rewrite the old commandments, right? When they dial the commandments down to 1, that's an example of everything you're seeing as well. Manipulation of the past to control the present, and as a result, the future. Important to isolate exactly what he's talking about there.
Another version. I mean, you said the whole beginning with the Lawrence Enquiry, but the Lawrence Enquiry comes very, very far down the chronological pattern of the lie, the noble lie. Of course, the original moment when black immigration begins into Britain in any conceivable numbers is Windrush. Windrush is subject to the most preposterous legend. The original people coming on Windrush were immigrants who wanted to better themselves. They were absolutely classic economic migrants. And generally speaking, because in those days, West Indies society was profoundly respectable, the men all arrived.
Quickly talking about what he said about the Lawrence Inquiry. For those who don't know, the murder allegedly took place in 1992. The Lawrence Inquiry, right, the report was published in 1999. That's how long the time was between those things.
In suits, and the women arrived in nice dresses, and they were married couples, and it was a very different from the vision of Stormzy. But they came over in just the same way that asylum seekers are doing now, for economic betterment. But instead, we've created this complete myth. They arrived because there were labor shortage. Labor shortages in 1940s Britain. We had the returning armies. The idea that these people arrived to rebuild Britain, this entire myth of Britain built on immigrants, begins with a self-evident and demonstrable lie.
And that was used then to spin myths like "you called, we came," right? I.e. Britain put out the call for these people, and then these people came, i.e. they're the heroes to come and rebuild Britain, right? Complete lie. I think Grok actually done an analysis on it. I think one time that I tried to work out what the exact labour shortfalls would be, even taking into account things like the returning armies and stuff like that, it would have taken longer for Britain to rebuild if we'd not had these people. Yes, it wasn't impossible by any means. If I'm not mistaken, the shortfall, really, with the war casualties, with people coming back, obviously it's difficult to take into account things like shell shock. It's much easier to take into account things like deaths, because obviously you have people that just don't come back, right? But the people then that do come back, how many of them have got shell shock? How many are injured? How many are debilitated? How many have got all of these different things, right? PTSD and all these other things that might, hamper their ability to work and so things and things like that. So if I'm not mistaken, though, the shortfall was really only about 4% based on the casualties versus the overall population of Britain. Now, if we're talking about the overall male population of Britain at the time, which obviously a lot lower than what it is today, I believe somewhere around half, obviously then that percentage is going to be something higher, but it's not something that Britain was so devastated in terms of its workforce that we absolutely needed these people to come over. But that's the lie that's been spun. That's the lie that's been spun. Britain would have absolutely recovered, no doubt about it. Just may have taken a little bit longer. Some might have had to delay retirement for a couple of years and whatever, and those kinds of things, right? Just goes to show how really destructive in that way the war was for Britain in particular. In many ways, it was the start of the decline of Britain in a massive way. Everything has been on a downward trajectory since 1945, if you ask most people. So yeah, massive mistruth and myth being spun from this.
I mean, again, Laurie, there's only one group of people that are indeed immigrants that you could say built Britain, and do you know who it is? It is the Irish labourers of the 19th century.
They don't count.
Who construct the railways, and before that, very often the canals, the extraordinary achievements of Victorian engineering. But of course, they are white, so they don't count. And repeatedly going through, again, of course, with the decision, the catastrophic decision, in my view, to respond to Enoch Powell's admittedly deliberately inflammatory speech by suppression, by saying we mustn't talk about these things. And it's very interesting. I don't know whether you're aware of it. One of the key people bringing direct pressure onto the Prime Minister, onto Edward Heath, was no other than the Lord Heseltine. Heseltine himself.
before we move on to this, but this thing about Enoch Powell, he called it inflammatory at the time because of how much society was changing. Think of the free love hippie movements, the pride movements come not long after. Society is trending in this massively liberal direction whereby any sentiment of conservative, anything really, especially with regards to immigration and these kinds of things, would have been shouted down as the first start majorly of censorship and those kinds of things. If you look back on what Enoch Powell was saying, a lot of people would think, looking at what you were saying back then, it might have been seen as quite inflammatory. It's quite conservative by the standards of what a lot of people are saying today, right? So you're seeing there that what was deemed one time inflammatory, right? And you think the people that are still alive from that generation, right, they would have seen that as inflammatory, and why they are so shocked by how, quote unquote extreme the discourse has gotten nowadays, where you've had another 60 years of problems since then, and you've had you have more generations growing up with this resentment and being sheltered and not understanding their history, and now understanding that they've had 60 more years of betrayals. That's why so many people now are casting off, all fear as to the previous labels that people were being called. But yeah, a lot of people would think that what Enoch Powell was saying is not only true, has borne so much in terms of actual truth value when he says rivers of blood flowing through Britain's streets, right? It's a very vivid, provocative image, right? But not only was it true, by many standards that many people would say today, you could argue it was even just conservative.
Has had an absolutely continuous role on, if you like, the extreme left of conservatism, going right back to his beginnings in the late 1960s and 70s. It's very striking. But what I want to argue with you is, argue's the wrong word, what I want to discuss is, this is only part of a much, much bigger problem. I think the problem of unreality, the problem of the political lie, the problem of deliberate untruth extends right across the whole of our politics, on right, left and centre again, though the focus of it, and once again,
when he talks about Lord Heseltine as well, guys, he actually served as a Conservative Member of Parliament from 1966 to 2001. Shows you it's not actually just Labour that is to blame for a lot of the things that we see in Britain nowadays. This is very much a uniparty issue. That's why many people who are, especially on the right of politics, even just regular people on the right, not even like ethno-nationalists or nationalists in general, they hate both Labour and the Conservatives. Conservatives because they were supposed to stand for these values. Labour, they could understand that this stuff was going to come, right? It hurts especially more, it makes you even more angry when it's the Conservatives that are now betraying the people of Britain. Just goes to show you about Lord Heseltine here when he's saying about the growing on the very far left, right? But he was actually in the Conservative circles. That tells you all you need to know. It tells you a lot about what you need to know about British politics.
Again, I think this needs spelling out very clearly. The point of real origination, it's no accident. You mentioned Jack Straw at the beginning. The point of real origination is the Blair government of 1997 onwards, and particularly the role, as we all know, of Alistair Campbell. Machiavelli is traditionally known as the father of lies. I think Campbell is a modern Machiavelli. He is the father of lies. He institutes lying as not simply the technique of last resort. That's always been true in politics. Remember, there's that wonderful remark of one of our great diplomats back at the beginning of the 17th century that an ambassador is sent to lie abroad for his country. Lie meaning resident, abroad, but also to lie for his country. So it's always been there. But the idea that not simply the last resort, but the first resort in politics is lying. That is Campbell. That is the world of Blair. But unfortunately, it's permeated everything.
Oh, here we go. We got a nice ad. Get out of here.
Quite. And while you went back to Machiavelli, let me go back to a line from Shakespeare, actually, that I think is quite significant here. So in Hamlet, at one point, he says, where he muses, really, there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And really, I mean, Shakespeare shows that actually, of course, that's not true, and that Hamlet is having bad dreams, and he has to avenge his father, and he can't just sort of descend into relativism in this way, although obviously that's quite persuasive to him at this point.
I think many would argue relativism is a large part of why we're in the slump that we're in as well. Brits having foregone things like objective morality and where that will come from and those kinds of things. This massively especially morally relativistic world. It's like you see people having these debates, but as soon as you see somebody come in with at least a foundation for objective morality, that's where you see then the debate really start to shift, usually in favor of them. You see debaters like Andrew Wilson, for example. There was a tremendous instance where he just kept getting Hutch caught in this morally relativistic language trap, because he would boil down to Hutch's worldview just being, Hutch a liberal by the way, being purely based on preferences, and then Andrew would be like, well, why are your preferences better than mine? You can't actually say that you're better than mine. So again, who's to win out? And not only that, then why would you, if my preferences are just as valid as your preferences, but they're the exact opposite, why would my preferences not be right? You get caught in these, the moral relativism thing is a thing that really does massively eat itself. That's why, again, maybe you could argue that British society is eating itself, or like the state is eating it. But again, without an objective morality, you can't make the case really of why that's a bad thing. Without objective morality, you can't really make the case as to why anything that's gone on in Britain, all the atrocities that people are very aggrieved about, are actually bad things. You need an objective standard to be able to do that.
But it seems to me like our political class believe today that there's nothing good or bad, but spinning makes it so.
That is absolutely true. Or indeed, there is nothing, or indeed, there is nothing at all unless it's talked about or invented. And this, I mean, let's just take, because it's very relevant, we are actually in that extraordinary budget period, this weirdest budget that we've ever had in our history. I mean, it's worth reminding ourselves that it's where are we now? We're in 2025. Back in 1940s.
Even people I know who are very liberal are very surprised and very aggrieved by this budget.
We had a real economist as Chancellor of the Exchequer. We had Hugh Dalton, a brilliant pupil at Cambridge of the great J.M. Keynes, and then LSE, where he was a lecturer, where he really formulates the whole modern thesis of redistribution, of the importance of avoiding, gap between the very rich and the very poor. This man falls, is instantly dismissed by Attlee, effectively on Budget Day in 1947, because a tiny detail was leaked inadvertently to a journalist a few minutes before the budget. Now, this extraordinary performance that we've had with Rachel Reeves, why is it? What's going on there? Well, there's been a piece in the Times, which I find very interesting, from somebody who I think, although he's in theory on the right, is in fact fully paid up member of the Campbell School of Politics, Danny Finkelstein, talking about, could the budget have been
hot name in media today, eh? The whole thing with the memes at the moment. My mum died in the holly. Obviously, the memes that have been spun by it, that people are reveling in at the moment. Not the most accurate. I believe he said it was his grandmother and his grandfather, but that's a little bit beside the point. He's getting a lot of hot water at the moment by basically, again, being one of these people that for Israel and for the Jews is basically advocating, an ethno-state and a safe space for them. Right, a safe country for them. But then when it comes to Britain, very much so changing his tune, then wondering why people then get more, quote unquote, anti-Semitic. Right, I made a post the other day saying that Rabbi Shmuley was one of the biggest promoters of anti-Semitism in the world, not because he's, quote unquote, anti-Semitic or anything like that, because the things he says drives up, quote unquote, anti-Semitism within me. Right, so again, promoting that, quote unquote, anti-Semitism in me. Again, I put, quote unquote, anti-Semitism because it's one of those words like racism that's been used to mean any sort of criticism, whatever, regardless of how valid, and even just being used to talk about things regarding the government of Israel, just the state of Israel and stuff like that. They, like, people that have been throwing this term around like a sword, right, have just devalued that term. People wonder why they don't care about being called it anymore, right? But yeah, I think that's quite important to talk about there, that Danny Finkelstein, when Piers Morgan had that conversation with Nick Fuentes, got schooled by Nick Fuentes for the most part. again, brought on Danny Finkelstein as if to be like, some kind of gotcha or whatever, and expecting Nick to change his view or anything like that. Just being like, ugh. And then the political tack that he's gone down to then, even Connor Tomlinson and other political commentators have been going back and forth with him on this, being like, oh yeah, we are our own people as well. Oh no, actually no, you're not your own people, but the Jews are their own people and they deserve their own state. You guys don't deserve your own state. We shouldn't even deport the Pakistani grooming gang rapists and stuff like that. Yeah, you can get the fuck out of here with that shit.
Pun better. Could there be a narrative that made it better? And he speculates how it could be done. She could say, she already had the one story that it was the result of the wickedness and mismanagement of the Tories. She could have another one that it's all about imposing Labour values. She could have another one that it's all about growth. What do all these three things have in common?
Well, they're stories. They don't bear much relation to the facts.
They're not true. They're not true. This budget is, as we all know.
Important to observe there, Orwell observed that you tell a lie long enough, the lie became the truth. That's what Labour are hoping for.
Is a product of wild economic incompetence, but also of an absurd belief.
The Greens would criminalise David Starkey for what he just said there, by the way, for calling, I believe he's saying here that Rachel Reeves is basically incompetent at what she's doing. The Greens cannot get in. They're absolute psychopaths. They'd be saying that any criticism or any correction to women by men will be deemed as misogyny, and that will be then a prosecutable offence. They're absolute psychopaths, in addition to wanting to legalise all drugs and all manner of other suicidal things. And even then, Zach Polanski, the traitorous scumbags over in Calais, literally aiding in the invasion of Britain. It belongs nowhere near British politics.
That you can actually, that the state can grow an economy by increasing taxation and spending money on public services as a regular practice. I mean, obviously, Keynes, we've mentioned Keynes. Keynes, at a moment of recession, talks about this as a possibility if you've got mass unemployment and something. This is how you deal with it. We are not in those circumstances. And to normalize this as an idea is insane. You see it again with Rachel Reeves having come up with a supposed theory called securonomics, in which apparently, if you improve roads and railways, and you look at what this money is being spent on, if you improve roads and railways, which of course will only bear fruit about 10 or 15 years down the line, bearing in mind how slowly we construct these things, somehow it will mysteriously happen. Growth will mysteriously happen. But at the same time, you're throwing vast amounts of money on welfare because Labour backbenchers insist.
Get the impression that they're basically throwing shit at a wall and seeing what sticks.
On it. Now, the idea that an economy will grow if you increase taxes hugely, twice, when you promise not to do it at all, if you increase regulation hugely with things like the new Employment Rights Act and so on, when you promise to diminish regulation, by definition, no economic growth will take place. So the narrative is independent of fact. I mean, this is genuinely postmodern. It is this notion that there is your quote from Hamlet being right. It is that absolute relativism of people like Derrida and Foucault, that there is no such thing as fact. It's just a question of power, or it's Humpty Dumpty. In I can never remember this, Alice in Wonderland or Alice Through the Looking Glass, where he says words mean what I want them to mean, neither more nor less. Alice, poor girl, says, "Oh, isn't that very confusing?" He responds, it's extraordinary how much Lewis Carroll anticipates modernity. He responds, "It's a question of."
Stay ahead and sharpen your
you gotta be kidding.
With Pluralsight.
What timing?
Learning.
Get the hell out of here.
Power.
There we go.
In other words,
that just a little bit.
How much Lewis Carroll anticipates modernity. He responds, "It's a question of power." In other words,
and how much do we see that bearing fruit in today's society, whereby, especially in this relativistic world, again, stemming from relativism again, you very easily just see dictionaries being rewritten, definitions being rewritten to include things that are completely either anathema or antithetical to what the word actually means, right? We're seeing now that it's just it's, again, hinting at force doctrine as well, which is, again, often comes up in a lot of debates around feminism, where, again, women, only have their rights because there's typically men there to enforce them, right? Men are the enforcement arm of society, or at least they always have been, right? In terms of being the military, in terms of being police force, in terms of having physical greater strength over women, right? And as a result, then, women are only afforded the privileges in society because men actually uphold them and sacrifice themselves for them, in terms of protecting them from outside threats, right? But hinting there, when it's all about power, is that, ultimately then is who has the greatest power, and usually that comes down to force, right? That's why the government has taken things like firearms from the British citizens away, made it very, very hard to obtain them, because then they have a monopoly on force, right? It's very easy for you to be arrested for a social media post, or for the police to go into drastic overreach on, in arresting you for whatever, right? If you are not armed, right? If there is not that counterbalance of force, right? That's why the state wants a monopoly on force, why they wanted to take guns away and those kinds of things, because it makes it so much easier to enact the things that they're doing now. How much harder would it be to take somebody in for a social media post if they were armed, right? How much harder, and again, imagine like in the context of a civilian militia, if the police weren't going to do their jobs with regards to the Pakistani rape gangs, for example, how many fathers, if they were armed and they could band together, do you think would have gone in by force and taken their daughters away and dealt with the perpetrators then and there? That's why they take the force. That's why they take the guns away. They take the force mechanisms away. You saw that in Bondi recently as well. You saw the fruits of that in Bondi. And obviously the government then came out and said that the biggest things they need to crack down on are hate speech, far right, diversity is our strength, and crack down on more private gun ownership, even though they had a mandatory buyback of about 650,000 firearms. Go and watch my episode where I done this on the podcast most recently as well, if you want to know more about this. In the late 90s, it hasn't worked. All you do is deprive good people of themselves against violent criminals and terrorists, which they have actively imported. So he's speaking to force doctrine there when he talks about power as well.
If I control this notion that if you
Hang on a sec,
control the
ladies and gentlemen.
narrative,
I'm going to pause this because I can't actually hear the scene. I can't actually hear what's going on. I'll be right back. You should be able to hear me. Can I hear what's going on? Right. Sincere apologies about that, ladies and gentlemen. Sincere apologies about that. But my interface, it's, in fact, if I lean this down here, you might be able to see it. It's this little thing right here. Yes, there's a Reese's calendar in the background. And that's my dog's crate for when I end up going out, because she's a mischievous little shit. This little thing here, which is powering the microphone of my headphones, sometimes it does this weird thing. Just try and recenter myself a little bit. There we are. Sometimes it does this weird thing where I can't hear the audio coming through my headphones, but it's still transmitting it through. So I don't know what the hell's going on. It usually means I need to unplug the thing and then plug it back in that way. Now, before I go on to anything else, I'm just going to make sure that I'm still coming through. Can you let me know if you can still hear me in like the stream and everything? Can you let me know? Okay, I think I am. Yeah, make sure you're involved in the chat as well. Make sure to get involved in the chat as well. I'll just go into a... There we go. Joe, how you doing, my friend? Joe, how you doing? Windrush were the first uninvited boat people. Yeah, absolutely. The first part of the conversation, we're on... the conversation has shifted more towards Labour's budget at the moment. I'm talking about more things going on in the modern day. But yeah, we've just been through all of the stuff around Windrush and people like John Sentamu and stuff like that. Yeah, good to see you, my friend. Good to see you. I'm hoping to keep the stream under 3 hours this time. But we'll see how we go. Right, okay, I was going to run a poll, but I forgot what I was going to run the poll about. So, yeah, I'll just quickly come back and we'll get on with the conversation again. But apologies about that, ladies and gentlemen. That's just a weird thing that sometimes happens. I'm just going to adjust this a little bit more. There we are. I'm now in the middle. Oh, no. Oh, hold on. Sorry. That was a very attractive face I just made. Okay, here we are. We're back.
this poor girl says, "Oh, isn't that very confusing?" He responds. It's
Cheers,
extraordinary
Ian.
how much Lewis Carroll anticipates modernity. He responds, "It's a question of power."
There we go. That was the
In
point
other
we were
words,
making.
if I control this notion that if you control the narrative, therefore reality changes. But we all know, of course, it wasn't true. Humpty Dumpty fell off the wall. Humpty Dumpty was broken. And all the narrative in the world doesn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again anymore, of course. I mean, that's why Lewis Carroll puts those words into his mouth. In other words, he is claiming that he can change fact simply by will in exactly the same way that Alistair Campbell tried to do it over, for example, weapons of mass destruction, in exactly the same way that Rachel.
Did someone say dodgy dossier?
Reeves is trying to do it with the present budget in exactly the same way, and on a much more extraordinary scale, of course. You have somebody like that ridiculous figure. I think we need to constantly say ridiculous figure of the new Green leader, ex-David Poulden, now Zach Polanski, the former Harley Street hypnotist who persuaded women that if they thought about it enough and paid enough, they would.
Good old Zavid Poldansky. Yeah, the guy who thought that the guy was promoting that women could think themselves into bigger breasts or something like that.
Grow from an AA to a DD cup. And the economic policies of the left are of a degree, an identical degree of silliness and unreality.
So on that question of the divorce from reality, to stay with the economic side of things for a second, we had this very illuminating cover story in the New Statesman shortly before the budget, which was going after what they call the bond vigilantes. And of course, fair enough, that's an interesting political topic. What do the bond markets think and how do they respond to politics? But it seemed to come as quite a revelation to a lot of lefties and lefty politicians that actually the bond market is not just a sort of number on a screen. It actually does reflect a real thing, which is the confidence in the amount of debt the government has and its ability to pay it. And that there is a base reality to our economic situation that can't be.
For those who may not know, because these are topics that I'm not really that familiar with as well, just from putting it into Google, a bond vigilante are bond investors who discipline governments for perceived fiscal irresponsibility or inflationary policies by selling government bonds, which pushes up interest rates and makes it more expensive for the government to borrow to borrow, forcing policy changes. So it seems as though it's a way of forcing the government hand by selling these bonds, which then pushes up interest rates and stuff like that, and makes it harder then for the government, or makes it more expensive for the government to borrow. Which again, if you're in debt, like I believe pretty much all of the Western nations are, if you're in America, for example, they're in like trillions of debt or whatever it is. It's a very powerful tool, it would seem. It was coined by economist Ed Yardeni in the 1980s. These investors act as market watchdogs, signaling disapproval of excessive spending or loose monetary policy by creating selling pressure that raises the borrowing costs of the issuer.
Gainsaid by ideas about modern monetary theory.
Oh, it can. Listen to our future Prime Minister, Andy Burnham. We mustn't be in hock to the bond markets.
Jesus Christ, I hope not.
This is Humpty Dumpty. This is wanting to wish reality away. Because, of course, once upon a time,
I could not think of anything like Keir Starmer is obviously just absolutely awful. I don't know what it'd be like with Andy Burnham, direct rape gang enabling in Telford. Andy Burnham being our Prime Minister, just
we were relatively.
Not to mention the global cities and stuff like that.
Insulated from the overseas market for the securities, the so-called gilt-edged securities, because a huge quantity of them were held by our own insurance companies to fund the final salary inflation-proofed pensions that were then common. They have virtually disappeared from the private sector. So the insurance companies no longer need to hold this kind of debt. So instead of it being held, as it were, within the British financial system, it's largely held, a very large amount, I think about 1/3 is held abroad. Hence, you may remember Mark Carney, the Canadian, bizarrely, who was governor of the Bank of England, saying we depend on the kindness of strangers. But there is this absolute refusal of the left to understand this. This is what is so staggering. Laurie, this is what is so-called modern monetary theory, which says that a country that is a sovereign country, that like ours controls its own currency, can create as much debt as it wants with no economic consequences. That, I think, should be renamed, called the Argentinian theory, because if you do that, you finish up like Peronist Argentina before Milei was elected, with inflation running at 300% per year, if you're lucky. But there's a real...
Say we want Mr. Alfuera, right? Cutting all the ridiculous public institutions and stuff like that, all the government agencies and all of those things. Oh, hang on a minute. There we go. I think I should be sounding a little bit better now. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, see on about him with regards to the whole relationship with Britain and the Falkland stuff and stuff like that. It seems to be where more the nationalist element of the Argentinian leader is coming through, right? We're going to have disputes over that. You can't argue necessarily that he hasn't done well for the Argentinian people with regards to his economic policy and anything like that. We may have disputes over land and stuff like that. That's a foreign policy. That's an argument we may have. But in terms of what he's done to turn Argentina around from the socialist dystopian pit that it was found in like 300% inflation and all stuff like that, maybe that's something we could take a leaf out of that book, again, seeing how well that has worked and how popular he is as a leader. You could see him versus Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson and David Cameron and those kinds of people, right? How popular he is versus those people. That says a lot, in my opinion anyway.
A much bigger point, Laurie. People on our side encourage this. We did exactly the same. I mean, after all, quantitative easing is another form of the magic money tree, resorted to, it is no accident, by Gordon Brown, leading the world in 2008, so-called solving the financial crisis. And I don't know whether you remember, my old colleague and friend at LSE, Mervyn King, who had become governor of the Bank of England, was reviled at the time for raising a question about it. He talked in rather indirect language. Governors of central banks have to
Gordon Brown, texture like sun, lays me down with my money, he runs.
Use that sort of indirect language because their words carry so much weight. He talked about moral hazard. The fact that you were buying out companies that should have gone bankrupt, whose shareholders should have suffered, whose boards of directors, frankly, very often should have been in.
Too big to fail is a massive problem purely because it enables this kind of cronyism that we're seeing a lot nowadays, right? Too big to fail. If a company then has been brought into thinking that it's too big to fail, what reason does it have to think about the prospect that it could happen if it could fail? Right, that's where a lot of Americans have that grievance at the moment, because a lot of American workers are getting screwed over with illegal labor, illegal aliens, those kinds of things, right? When companies feel as though they're too big to fail, or when companies are, and they know they're too big to fail because they'll get bailed out by something, it's no surprise they act unethically.
Jail, you were buying them out, and you were buying them out from public money. And of course, at the time, it seemed such a wonderfully easy solution. We had a world financial crisis, and somehow we could just magic up endless billions of money. And do you know what? We liked it so much. Those on the right, remember, there was a Conservative government in Britain from 2010 to 2024. We continued doing this throughout because we discovered it was absolutely lovely. Because not only could you magic up as much money as you wanted, you could also have it for nothing. You had virtually zero interest rates.
Convenience.
And you know what?
Convenience is a massive problem. Think of all the people that are sleepwalking into getting us into digital ID at the moment because they won't stop to think about what happens if cash disappears and all of these things. If they shop local, why their high streets have disappeared and all of these things, right? Convenience is a massive thing. We've been lulled into this massive sense of convenience, drunk on convenience almost to the point where we've fallen asleep and just walking on autopilot now. And as a result, then the people who are in control of that, they can massively tailor that and use it to our detriment. So yeah, convenience has been a massive vector by which these things have been pushed forward.
I'm coming to the conclusion that somebody, and it's probably not me because I've got too much on, needs to write a book on those years from 2008 to 2022. If you remember, the bubble bursts in 2022. The consequences of in this country of Liz Truss, but more particularly of the COVID bubble, of the extraordinary amounts that we create by in Britain, especially create by quantitative easing during COVID. I mean, at least 400 billion, 500 billion. You know, some said something like half to a third of GDP just magicked up like that. And this wasn't the left. This wasn't modern monetary theory. This wasn't Varoufakis. They've all got funny names, don't they? This wasn't Varoufakis. This wasn't Polanski. These were allegedly respectable people like George Osborne, like, for heaven's sake, Rishi Sunak, the supposed, centrist, deeply skilled, absolutely impeccable background on both sides of the Atlantic. So I think what we've lived through, Laurie, and you.
And then when he outlived his usefulness, he went to work for, he went to be at Goldman Sachs in California, or was that before he became British Prime Minister? But biggest thing for Rishi Sunak with me, we're about halfway through the conversation thereabouts now, guys, by the way. It was that scene of him holding the 50 pence coin with like diversity as our strength, or diversity built Britain and stuff like that. That was the biggest mark of our decline. That was the biggest mark of our decline, really, in modern memory. I'm not really old enough to think about what was going on in 2008. I was only 9 years old, but certainly COVID was a massive wake-up call, if you will. Seeing that COVID was basically the biggest power transfer, wealth transfer from the poorest to the wealthiest in recent memory. Just absolutely disgusting. Not to mention the people that have gone on and died, with horrific clots and all of these things from the jab. And again, trust the experts, right? Safe and effective, 6 feet social distancing, all of these things. Again, more and more lies is why people are so aggrieved with all of these things.
Spent a very large part of your life through is in a world in which, because money could be borrowed for nothing and apparently created with no adverse consequences, I think the whole business of woke, which again is a world in which words have no meaning. I think, in other words, you might, and I'd be interested, I want to put this to you, you're bright and you're profoundly well informed. Am I being far-fetched in seeing a connection between this world in which we magic money and the idea, for example, of transgenderism, the notion in which magically, by saying I am a woman, I become a woman? Isn't there an extraordinary point of similarity in which we say, that it's wrong that the world was created by whites? Whites are wicked. It's perfectly clear that all the good things in the world were created by blacks, because blacks and browns are good people and whites are bad people.
Easy way to think about this is that you hear the claim a lot, especially with regards to America, that America was built by slaves and all of this stuff, right? And without the black slaves, there would be no America. Stephen Crowder had done a tremendous bit on this. He was like, okay, well, if that was the case, if it was the slaves that were the factor that built America, right, and nothing else, then surely in Africa, where they have black leaders and black slaves, surely that Africa should be a super America right now. But it's not. Zimbabwe, when it went from Rhodesia to Zimbabwe, graduated from electricity to candles. So is clearly something else at play here. So I tell you what I want to do, a bit quick, ladies and gentlemen. I know there's not exactly many viewers here at the moment, but there's one thing I do want to do, just as I bring up this. To everybody that's on YouTube, hi, hope we're all doing well. Hope we are all doing fantastic. I just want to quickly run this, and basically it is oh shit, bear with me 2 seconds, because I just need to quickly pop off, not off the stream, but just pop over to the other room 2 seconds. So I want to run a poll. I just want to quickly run that. There we are. Poll should be running in the YouTube chat. So I'll leave that run just for a couple of minutes. Whilst that does that, I will be back in about 1 minute. Okay, sincere apologies about that, guys. I just had to go get a drink because I realized I hadn't actually grabbed like water or anything like that. I've been managing on whiskey at this moment in time. So awesome. So we ran that poll for a couple of minutes. We'll just end there. So yeah, had to see that pretty much lining up what my thoughts are. I don't necessarily think David is being very far-fetched at all. So we had a 100% out of the 4 votes, which given we're at 8 viewers, not so bad. Not so bad. All right. Apologies about that, ladies and gentlemen. We'll get straight back into it. Now. Hope you all enjoyed the little, what was it? Music in the break. Okay, let's bring this up. Awesome.
Am I being far-fetched in seeing a very strong interconnecting thread, which is postmodernism, which is the denial of reality, which is the assumption if you have the power and you control the narrative, you control the story, then that's the reality.
No, I don't.
Postmodernism basically being the denial of objective truth again. So again, basically you can argue that it leads into like things like Mike makes right and those kinds of things. A denial of objective morality and objective truth.
I think you're being far-fetched at all. I think it's a commonplace of ideological leftism that, well, you mentioned Hitler earlier on, and perhaps he could actually fit into this, but more broadly, I would say that the communists are the ones who would have had the grandiosity of ideology and the belief that human nature and the world itself is completely manipulable by humanity, and that therefore all that is really required to do that is extremely strongly adhered to ideology. So if you can...
I'm not going to say the name, right? You know, the Transformers, right, if you will. Very much so on the communist bent rather than any other bent. There's literally an image saying that the trans flag with what appears to be a woman on it wearing a mask with a gun, right? Appears to be some like kind of AR-15 or something like that. And on the mask or on somewhere on the flag, somewhere like down on her or whatever, it actually has the communist insignia on it. What I'll try and do is maybe try and find that image a little bit later on after the conversation so I can show you that. But yeah, very much so on the communist side more than, what would be considered like maybe like the nationalist socialist side or something like that.
Get everyone reading from the same hymn sheet, you can move mountains. And one great example, actually, that we've had discussed recently on this podcast is the Soviet scientist Trofim Lysenko, who was given the job by Stalin to preside over, well, it came to be known as Lysenkoism, but this was basically their attempt to rework traditional Western understandings of agronomy and basically genetics in plants, and to say that it didn't come down to genes, as Mendel had shown, but actually you could completely change the yields of plants and agriculture by what was done to them only within their lifetime. And this was analogous to the way that the Soviet state treated its individual citizens with a view to create the new Soviet man. So anyway, that's a long way of agreeing there.
No. I mean, let's continue on this, Laurie, because I think it is the central theme. But of course, it wasn't started by communism. It started by the French Revolution. The thing that's so different about the French Revolution, everybody, the lazy thinking, and it's particularly dangerous, lazy thinking in America, is that the French Revolution is a continuation of the American one. Nothing could be further from the truth. The American Revolution is barely a revolution at all. It's an extremely effective revolt against Britain and the British Empire, that is true. But
just to give you an idea, guys, as well, because I talked about it before, I'm not exactly an expert in this field. Right? I'm not an expert in this field by any means. Nothing that I've studied in the past has anything to do with any of these fields. But Lysenkoism, in and of itself, right, is an agricultural. This is reading from Grok, by the way. So again, maybe take this with a grain of salt, right? You heard Laurie talk about it a little bit. Agricultural theory promoted by Soviet biologist Trofim Lysenko in the mid-20th century, which rejected Mendelian genetics and favored the idea that acquired traits could be inherited. It emphasized environmental influences over genes, leading to practices like vernalization to supposedly improve crop yields. Supported by Stalin, it suppressed dissenting scientists and contributed to famines and setbacks in Soviet agriculture and biology.
Constitution that emerges in America is manifestly grounded in the traditions of Britain and also the traditions, of course, which the colonists had taken with them. You know, the thing that's so surprising about English colonists, and we really are talking about England, is wherever they go, the first thing they do is create self-government. You know, those people landing in inconceivably awful conditions in Massachusetts, the Pilgrims, amongst the first things they do is to sit down solemnly and to say, we are going to set up a representative council. You know, we're going to sort of more or less replicate Westminster in the middle of the wilderness. It's completely extraordinary. So the American Revolution, and again, the Americans keep language, they keep law, they, as you know, they keep imperial measure and have continued to keep imperial measure long after we've been seduced with the French rationalist nonsense of the metric system. But France was completely different. The French Revolution was a genuine attempt at remaking society from the bottom upwards. And of course, the foundation of conservatism in an intellectual sense of the world is the response to that in the marvelous work of Edmund Burke, first in the Reflections on the Revolution in France, in which he...
The French Revolution was also very happy and very pro lopping people's heads off.
Points out the profound danger of what you describe, this notion that arbitrarily you can suddenly transform man, human institutions, weights and measures. I mean, the French try not simply to make weights and measures decimal, but to make the days of the week, the hours, the year, the months, you know, complete insanity. And of course, it doesn't fit. And I think that what we on the right need to do is to have our profound awareness of this, which I think we lost. The thing that went so catastrophically wrong with the Conservative Party in 2010, this is also very strikingly true in America as well with the Republicans, because of course, as we all know, the relations between Blair and George W. were incredibly intimate, and America has its exact equivalent.
Tells you a lot about maybe George W. Bush being a quote-unquote conservative if he was very intimate with Tony Blair, right? You know, not necessarily intimate in that way, right? But again, the black lines and the Epstein, you know, revelations, maybe we'll highlight something on that. I don't know. But yeah, a lot of things I think went wrong in 2010. A lot of things I think we can agree went wrong in 2010. Looking back on it, it was an absolutely catastrophic time. So obviously, David Cameron, a globalist like all the rest.
Under the Republicans of Alistair Campbell, in the man who's just died, Dick Cheney. And Dick Cheney actually talks about the fact, in complete postmodern terms, that reality can be manufactured. He says, we're an empire. The facts are what we make them. And you see, I think, particularly in the invasion of Iraq, the conscious notion we can invent fact. It's perfectly clear that the invasion of Iraq was simply an act of rather childish, in my view, childish vengeance for the terrible attack on the Twin Towers. It was, you know, let's find somebody we can beat up. But instead...
If you've watched Tucker Carlson's series on it, I know on some of his other things he could be described as having a couple of alternative. Some would describe him as kooky, some would describe him as outright traitorous, right? People have different opinions on some of his other views. I did very much like his series on 9/11, which he'd done on YouTube, the 9/11 files. I thought he'd done that extremely well, at least for the most part. Just, you know, even interviewing quite... informed figures like John Kiriakou, for example, and other people who lost relatives on 9/11 and stuff like that. But the whole thing was geared around, it wasn't, in my opinion, the whole thing was around like, Israelis and Jews and all of those things. That was like a part of it. Potential Israeli government involvement was part of it. But again, just a call for an actual a truly independent, truthful inquiry. But yeah, absolutely. 9/11 happens, there's so much conspiracy around it, so many lies told around it, but look at, this is where you see the destruction that can really come from lies, right? And the whole noble lie thing that was told to people who were not British that they were British, right? The whole noble lie, like Morgoth put out on that post, right, on X, right, where he talked about the noble lie, calling people that weren't English, right, because it was a noble lie. You're seeing the damage that comes from potentially really any kind of lies. I think that's important for us to consider as well.
You invent spurious cause, so-called weapons of mass destruction, and then you invent backwards an even madder aim, which is to make Iraq a modern democratic society. Again, so in other words, the right subscribing to precisely the same preposterous doctrine as communism, that you can remake a society. It's somewhere, as you know, as extraordinarily unpropitious ground for democracy as Iraq could never have been conceived of. I mean, it's a country which had never known, indeed, if it's a country at all, it's something carved out of a series of empires with intensely tribal politics that had only ever known violent dictatorship.
I suppose the important thing to consider as well, is, and I'm pausing it a lot, is that you can remake society, I suppose, if you enforce whatever the doctrine is for long enough, right? And if you enforce it hard enough. That's why you see in dictatorships like North Korea and stuff like that, where they're so indoctrinated and those kinds of things, right? The regime is upheld by the force, right? So I suppose the argument to be made here is that you can remake society in that regard. The ethics question is a different question, but you can do it, I suppose, if you have the requisite force and if you apply it for long enough and you continue to apply it. I suppose what we're seeing now, where, again, the government just simply does not care about these, protests like the one that is apparently was taking place in December, right, or whatever, or January next year, the whole next Tommy Robinson gathering thing, whatever. It seems as though it's kind of like just to let people let off steam, but in a way that could be seen as like a containment effort. It's the force is always on the one side, and that can continue to enforce the regime and continue to reshape society for as long as that force is in place. Because until you have a force that's bigger to overthrow that force, who's to stop it?
And the idea that you could suddenly turn this by invading into a modern liberal democracy. We repeat the error again under the same leadership in Afghanistan. We repeat it again.
Yeah, they don't want it.
In Libya. This is the right doing this sort of neo-French revolutionary stuff. We're all guilty. And that we need a profound new reckoning. But of course, those most guilty of this are the people who ruled us from 1997 to 2010. I mean, the Blair government did have this ambition. You want to replace the United Kingdom with this supposed unitary national state of Britain. You try to invent British values. You tear apart the structure of politics centered on the Westminster Parliament, which left enormous social independence and cultural independence to Scotland, but united.
And how much have we seen, quote unquote, British values used to fuel the exact policies which with the British people, right, the distinct British people, have the exact grievances with? Should we say it's against British values to not welcome migrants, right? This completely fabricated notion to get away from the idea that there is such a thing as a British people that are a collective of very specific Northwestern European tribes with their own complicated history and those kinds of things, right? It's all just been about values. It's all just been about values, right? And then, what does it matter if we recreate pagan representations with Africans in them, even though it never actually existed? It's all about values. You're seeing how this all comes down to a very damaging cascade, which has civilization destroying capacity.
The politics. You tear the politics apart as well. You decide to do something that not even the French Revolution, and it's really important we understand this. I mean, last night I was doing a talk in which I talked about all these kind of things, and there was the inevitable intervention. What about immigration? But of course, this pattern is also fundamental to this sudden eruption of immigration, because there is he called Andrew Nether? I can't remember, the chap who spilled the beans on rubbing our noses in diversity as that of the actual aim of the Blair government. But what's really striking, I think, is to go back to all the previous attempts at the creation of new societies. The great problem was they couldn't change the people. And you may remember there's a very famous story, and it's one that I'm fond of telling because it carries all kinds of other good jokes in its wake. This is Bertolt Brecht, the licensed, I call him the Ian Hislop of East Germany, the licensed satirist, the one who was allowed to make the little tiny joke within all the accepted boundaries and hugely rewarded and, smothered in laurels and whatever. Anyway, there was the East German Rising. In the early 1950s, and the East German government expressed, its deep...
Sorry again, because I'm not familiar with his name. For those of you who don't know, I'm familiar with his name, but not familiar who he is. Ian Hislop is a British journalist, satirist, and television personality. He's the editor of the satirical magazine Private Eye, a position he has held since 1986.
Disappointment that the German people hadn't enjoyed being liberated as much as they should have done. And you get Bertolt Brecht's very, very clever response, writing to the German government saying, well, the German people were clearly deeply shameful in their behavior. Wouldn't the proper response be, and listen to it carefully, it's this marvelous inversion, shouldn't the government dissolve the people and elect another one? Now, that wonderful turning on its head, which I think is the art of genuinely great satire, unlike Ian Hislop.
I just want to rewind that segment. Sorry, guys. I'm distracted because my dog has decided she's going to go have a massive schizo fit and start playing with all of her toys at the same time. So I'm just keeping an eye on her at the moment. I want to just quickly rewind that. I'm really sorry because there was something I think that he said there that was extremely important.
The German people were clearly deeply shameful in their behavior. Wouldn't the proper response be, and listen to it carefully, it's this marvelous inversion, shouldn't the government dissolve the people and elect another one? Now, that wonderful...
Is that not just basically, a whole thing about the what people call the Great Replacement? The government is basically dissolving the people. I think he's talking about this. Again, check it in the chat if I'm reading this wrong because I've accidentally misheard something or whatever. I believe he's still talking about this in the context of the satirical magazine and stuff like that. He just said there about dissolving the people. Is that not basically what the government is doing, dissolving the entire British society as is to bring in more people from outside? Because obviously they want to overthrow the system of governance that we have. Not the system of governance, but the system of democratic power that the citizens have. They want to institute a system of totalitarianism whereby they are all powerful and they even have control over exactly what you think, what you know, and those kinds of things, right? That is insane. That is insane, that idea. But insanity, this is the biggest thing why the world seems so insane at the moment. Insanity has become reality.
Full turning on its head, which I think is the art of genuinely great satire, unlike Ian Hislop. But so it is genuinely great satire. But what happened under Blair? He did change the people. This radical transformation in Britain from an essentially homogenous white country into one where 30%.
Important to note, it had been building long before Blair, but he massively opened the floodgates and turned this acceleration up to 11.
Where we are now, you will have the facts and figures at your fingertips. What is it? Immigrant first and second generation. It's of the order of 30%, isn't it?
Well, it depends which one you're going by, but the white British population in England is in the mid-70s, I think, and I think it's by 2035 that the first and second generation population is set to be a third. So, yeah.
I mean, it is terrifying
because, as I spoke about on a short, which I put on YouTube a little while ago, which I'll I'll see if maybe I can go find the link and put it in the chat later, or I might see if I could do it on my phone so it doesn't interrupt the broadcast, is that minoritization is the point of like crossing the event horizon on a black hole, whereby you can't escape what's coming from that point onwards because you literally have no say. So whereas light can't escape a black hole because it's literally being pulled in by a force that's greater than the speed of light. Obviously, like, light has no mass, so it's a little bit weird, right? I understand all that, but it's like the force of the pull of gravity is so great because of the bending of space-time quite literally into this one point, right, that light cannot even escape. It's like the force of what's going to happen when you get minoritized is so great that you will have literally no say in what happens from that point onwards. That's why minoritization is so dangerous.
It is. So in other words, I think what we need to understand, Laurie, is that the what Blair did in terms of a fantasy of, as Jack Straw talks about, a fantasy of this new. Do you remember that wonderful, the cool Britannia? We were a new country. We all laughed our heads off. But in retrospect, actually, probably Blair succeeded more than any other person, more than the French revolutionaries, more than Stalin, more than Hitler, in genuinely refashioning a country. But of course, refashioning it not into this nirvana, not into this utopia, but into a hideous, distorted parody of its former self. And I think we really do need to understand the appalling consequences we're reaping of this. And of course, the consequences that in 2010, conservatives, remember, conservatism is a profoundly difficult doctrine because it begins in the defeat of the Great Reform Act and Robert Peel's, as it were, endeavor to negotiate with that. And the only conservative politician who has ever come up with the ability to balance old and new in a rational and intellectually convincing way. In other words, to build on the great achievement of Edmund Burke is Benjamin Disraeli, after he brought in the Second Reform Act, that great speech that he gives in Edinburgh. As I always like to point out, I'm...
On a little point before we move on, so I'm aware that I was putting something in the chat, so that's why I might have missed a little bit there, but he did say something called the Great Repeal Act. At least from what I understand, the Great Repeal Act was the informal name for the UK's European Union Withdrawal Act of 2018, crucial piece of Brexit legislation designed to transfer thousands of existing EU laws into UK law and repeal the European Communities Act of 1972, ECA 1972 is what it's often referred to as, ensuring legal continuity as the UK left the EU by converting EU rules into domestic legislation rather than deleting them. This process aimed to remain stability, preserved rights, and allow a parliament to amend laws later, effectively ending the direct supremacy of EU law in the UK. That's what that Great Repeal Act, or the European Union Withdrawal Act, was meant to be.
Doing this, and you two are probably as well, with a glass of water. We have all these modern means of communication. Disraeli and Gladstone give 2-hour speeches without any form of amplification in huge rooms, thousands of people. Admittedly, there are shouters, there are people at the edges sort of passing it on, but it must have been an extraordinary experience. But they are lubricated, in Disraeli's case, with a couple of bottles of brandy. This isn't even gin, it's very sad. But what Disraeli says in 1867 is fascinating, Britain, he says, is a progressive country. Therefore, change is inevitable. He sounds like a Blairite. But then, that's what's quoted in the dictionaries of quotations.
Sorry, guys, I was on mute. So Benjamin Disraeli, Prime Minister from 1868 and also again in 1874 to 1880. This is how far back these issues go. We're going back to the 19th century. I do apologise for being on mute. I forget to take myself off.
But then what he goes on to say is, the question is what kind of change? Is it change in accordance with the traditions of the, and customs of the country? This is Burke's good change. Or is it the bad change of abstract, rootless international liberalism, which is the French revolutionary approach, which is the Russian approach, which is the Hitler approach, which was the Blair approach? But unfortunately, in 2010, Cameron decided that what Blair had done was to bring about a new political settlement, and as a good conservative, he should preserve it. And he says from 2005 onwards that he wants, when he's elected leader of the Conservative Party, he wants it to be a modern liberal Conservative Party, which, if you think about it, is an absolute contradiction in terms. And it is the
liberal conservative. And that tells you where, again, so much went wrong in 2010 in particular, right? You had the 1997 when Blair was elected, 2010 when Cameron was elected. It's because, again, the quote-unquote conservatives were operating as the exact opposite as they were supposed to. Funny where people have their grievances with the Conservative Party now, not just to mention who their leader is and who one of their last leaders was.
Disaster that the Conservatives went along, and indeed it's primarily under their watch that you get this destruction of the value of money, because of course all that money that was created by quantitative easing, it didn't just go away. This is the myth. It went first because it was essentially, before COVID, was contained within the banking system. It went into the extraordinary inflation of assets, of share prices and of houses. And then with COVID, went through the whole business of Sunak's policies, or furlough and whatever, it went into people's pockets. The moment the restrictions of the lockdown were over, you got this gigantic splurge of unearned money into the economy, which is why inflation peaks under Liz Truss in 20.
So quantitative easing, for those of you who don't know, including myself, by the way, so I'm just researching these or just having a quick Google as to what these terms mean. It's a central bank tool whereby they buy large amounts of government bonds and other assets to inject money into the economy, lower long-term interest rates, and stimulate borrowing, investment, and spending, especially when traditional rates aren't enough. By increasing liquidity, it makes it easier for cheaper for businesses and individuals to borrow. So it's a little bit like the opposite of what we saw earlier. The bond vigilantes trying to increase the cost of borrowing. This is meant to do the opposite. So central banks create more money. They create more money digitally. They buy assets. They increase liquidity. This should then lower interest rates and therefore stimulate the economy. That's the theory behind it anyway.
2022. This is why, of course, because in reality,
I think many would argue that I don't know if it hasn't exactly worked.
You have Rachel Reeves doing exactly the same thing, increasing tax and spending most of it on welfare and increasing the wages of public sector workers whose productivity is zero. In terms of the welfare people, and very, very low in terms of the public sector. So, of course, inflation continues to be a problem. But the Conservatives consolidated this. The Cameroon Conservatives embedded this. They embodied the unreality and they embedded it. And trying to escape from this is going to be the profoundest, most difficult tasks.
Imagine what would happen if people
go away ads. Go away, I don't care.
So you mentioned immigration there, and there's obviously the issue of the people coming in and the dissolution or the dissolving, as Bertolt Brecht put it.
I can't say much. There's going to be ads on this stream if people want to go back and rewatch it, so I'm sorry.
Of the people in that very literal sense, but also to go back to a lesser known part of the Blairite multicultural settlement. In 2000, there was the Perec report, which you may recall.
No, I don't. Fill me in.
But so very much fitting with this idea of the infinite malleability of populations, the idea that you can just rewrite history and then create a different future. What this was saying was that we needed to move away from a vision of Britain as a majority and a minority. So, the majority ethnic white British group and then other minorities that were just sort of allowed to be included. But actually we're saying, no, we shouldn't have that. This was a defunct understanding. We had to move towards a Britain as a, quote, community of communities. And indeed...
Sorry, forgive me. No, sorry, I'm not playing a game with you here, Laurie. Who wrote this?
Diversity is a strength. Multiculturalism is all good, ladies and gentlemen.
Commissioned by the Labour government. His first name escapes me, actually, but it was Perec, who is, I think, an academic and who's now a Labour peer. But the point is commissioned by the Blair government. It comes in actually with some hostility in the press. People are saying it's outrageous that this report is essentially denouncing Britishness as a racist identity in itself. And so initially it seems like the recommendations are going to be shelved, but actually later they are taken up. And these are essentially earmarking funding for projects that essentially attempt to rewrite history.
Good thing he said there. I'm glad I posted there. Rewrite history. If what I've got here is to be believed, we're talking here about an individual known as Bhikkhu Perec, if I'm not mistaken, right? Bhikkhu is spelled B-H-I-K-H-U, Perec, member of the House of Lords of the United Kingdom. He is a quote-unquote British political theorist. I'm guessing his name would... let's see if it says where he is actually... born. I don't know if it actually says where he's born. He might be born in Britain. I don't know. Where is it? There we go. I thought that's where he'd be from. He is actually, it says British. He's from Amritsar, Gujarat in India. Amritsar, Gujarat in India. He is a British political theorist, academic and life peer. He is a Labour Party member of the House of Lords. He was professor of political theory at the University of Hull from 1982 to 2001, and a professor of political philosophy at the University of Westminster from 2001 to 2009. I speak a lot about how the rot coming through a lot of the public institutions and especially the public school system. I talk about it a lot with Kimberly Isherwood, for example, in my conversation with Kimberly Isherwood, and there's going to be another important conversation coming with another member of PCBW next year, which I'll hopefully get lined up in the next few weeks. Where you have this rot coming through the public institution. I forgot I was going to go with it, but again, foreigners acting on foreign interest and usurping British public institutions to push these foreign interest narratives. It's no surprise in this instance it comes from a foreigner himself, who's born in Gujarat in India, scamming the British public much like his people scam regular people all across the world every single day.
And center minorities throughout British history and things like this to say, well, we've always been multicultural. Don't you know that?
Which is a lie.
Absolute lie.
Quite.
Which takes us back full circle. I mean, this again is fascinating. I mean, as you know, I really am a newcomer to the history of the 20th and 21st centuries, and I suppose one of the reasons that I've been able to do what I have is that I, heightened by my familiarity with, of course, one of the earlier periods of absolutely fundamental change of the Reformation and the Renaissance period, where in exactly the same way you have this media revolution of printing, precisely corresponding, it seems to me, in its effects with the social media and the internet nowadays, and the profound destabilization resulting from that. But I am taken by surprise. I mean, I was familiar only with one other very remarkable statement, which is the speech in 2003 by Charlie Falconer, the man who becomes the First Lord Chancellor of the reduced chancellorship and the world of the Supreme Court and all the rest of it that the Blair government engineers, in which he explicitly says in 2003 that it's time that much, if not most, decision-taking was shifted from Parliament. He actually says this, that it's better that it goes to experts, as with the Bank of England Monetary Policy committee, better it goes to lawyers. He was, of course, a lawyer. He would say that, wouldn't he? I hadn't realized that, this is my ignorance, that they were explicit enough even to have announced the determination of multiculturalism. That, do they actually use the word? They don't use multiculturalism, they use this community of communities. Is that the language?
I think it probably did, but certainly that was the key point anyway. And so the report was by the Runnymede Trust, naturally enough,
yes,
and it was titled The Future of Multi-Ethnic Britain.
The term community of communities is an example of how, again, the lie of multiculturalism, the lie of diversity, all these things about integration and all of these things. If it was actually an integrated community and all of these things, it wouldn't be a community of communities, it would just be a community.
And for instance, that phrase, community of communities, was used by the king himself only a couple of years ago. I mean, this has become very, very central to our official state understanding.
It has become the official narrative. I mean, I think what is profound, I find, though I think it's very easy to understand why the monarchy has slipped into this, I think there is a direct connection between all of this and late empire. If you remember, the view of late empire, which is put forward brilliantly by Quentin Hogg in his 1947 little book on conservatism, is that the empire is trusteeship. By definition, all the colonies will become miraculously self-governing dominions, complete with Westminster parliaments, with nice black and brown men sitting there in black robes with, white wigs, and all enforcing Erskine May on an enlightened two-party system, elected by universal franchise, which, as we know, did not quite happen. So I think that liberal view of empire, which received, an incredible rocket boost from 1945. So much of what we're talking about, Laurie, I think, is a consequence. Why do these insane ideas of the French Revolution or of the Russian Revolution, why are they so, despite all the evidence of their profound destructiveness, the fact that we're already seeing France on its Fifth Republic, and the Fifth Republic is clearly not going to survive, I would have thought, more than another 12 or 18 months. Why do we continue doing this? And one of the things, I think, is, one of the reasons that it acquired a kind of...
Wasn't it not too long ago the French Parliament actually collapsed, actually full-on, collapsed? Like the coalition between Macron and the communists full-on collapsed. You had anarchy on the streets of Paris. You had rioting. Funny how the Antifa guys, when they win, they riot. When they lose, they riot. It's almost like rioting is the whole thing. It's almost like rioting and destructiveness is the whole communist thing, right? They can't build a truly good society. All they can do is continue the revolution, the violent revolution, and tear things down. But I'm already saying, it was a couple of months ago, I think I covered it on the podcast as well, that the French, the whole government just completely collapsed. A lot of governments in this modern world are not long for this world, I don't think.
Rocket booster is 1945, the sense of relief at the end of the Second World War, the awareness that it was a second war of hideous magnitude within.
It's mad how we liberated the French. We as in Britain, right? Obviously not we as in me. I wasn't there, right? But we as in Britain, we liberated the French, and they repay us in the modern day by flooding our country and allowing our country to be flooded with third worlders. Tremendous. Thanks, guys. You're doing us a tremendous favor here. Not only were you stabbing us in the back with the bloody colonies in America that you cost us in that civil war, now you're costing us our very homeland, right? Seems like liberating you in 1945 was a bit of a mistake.
Half a lifetime.
Satirically, obviously.
The time is 20 years. Only 20 years between the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second, and that determination to try to stop it ever again, and their decision to adopt universal liberal values, which is, of course, the engine of the United Nations, the engine of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and so on. And what is profound, what it seems to me to be so extraordinary, you use the instrument that had powered Stalin. as supposedly the thing that will guarantee liberty. The complete failure to understand that the proper view is the Burkean view, that human societies change slowly, that change needs to be carefully handled, that the notion that you can go around and kind of, on special offer, have a kind of constitutional Primark at which you buy this year's latest number, and every society can just wear it. We bought into that rubbish. We repeated that rubbish with George W. Bush and Tony Blair. We repeated it above all with Fukuyama and the end of history. I mean, it's just extraordinary. In other words, this is not just a phenomenon of the left. The left now look washed up because the right is actually beginning to, as it were, come slowly, reluctantly to its senses. But I think, and I think this conversation is part of it, we are undergoing one of those, one hesitates to use words like seismic, it makes you sound very pompous and silly, but I think we are undergoing a genuine shift of how we think about the world.
Seismic would not be an adjective out of place in this example, in my opinion. Think of how scared people have been. The seismic shift has come in this instance, how scared people were being called racist and these other labels, transphobic and stuff like that. In many instances, because being labeled as these things, as I have and many others have, carry a death sentence. They carry a tacit death sentence or a silent death sentence. As soon as somebody utters these words about you, it is implied that your name is now put on a paper in which your life is fair game. Think of how seismic it has to be that more people than ever before are no longer scared of being called these things, are no longer scared of being called racist, being called transphobic, being called xenophobic, whatever it is, right? What Nazi, fascist, all of these things, because they realize what is at stake if they don't, if they are scared, right? That is a seismic shift. Think of how many young British girls were raped and all other manner of atrocity, right, which you can go and read about, obviously, and I talk about it at length in many episodes, because there were allegations of racism and Islamophobia, religious discrimination, all of these things which people have lost their lives for. That is a seismic shift. Seismic is not an adjective that is out of place here, in my opinion. The political shift has been seismic. That's why so many people have been thrown into so much uncertainty at the moment. Right? It reminds me of a little bit of the scripture in this instance, where again, I'm not going to get preachy. But where Christ is alleged to have said in the scripture that I came to bring a sword, and I came to. I'm paraphrasing here because I don't know the scripture off the top of my head. Basically like turn son against father, turn family members against child. I came to bring a sword. I did not come to bring peace. I came to bring a sword. Right? That's what it feels like at the moment. And that's what it feels like. It's so much of a conflict, because now people realize what's at stake, and the shift has been absolutely seismic. There's no doubt about it.
Which I hope is, as it were, putting us the right way up after we've had a world turned upside down by this preposterous refusal of fact, this refusal to believe that there are facts, that wonderful moment of Dr. Johnson disproving Bishop Berkeley by kicking a rock. There's a fact, it's hard, it hits you. Which seems a jolly appropriate moment when we're thinking about a budget, doesn't it?
So to sort of take up that idea again.
Nah, feelings over facts, guys. Feelings over facts. That's actually what I heard somebody say on a podcast recently. I know, feelings over facts. I think they were saying it rather satirically, but a lot of people do think that way. Of
the social engineering aspect here, the belief that society is like putty in a politician's hand, that they can just remold at will. I mean, you mentioned universalism as a communistic ideology, in many ways opposed to particularism, but this in many ways is what the crusade of the anti-racist state is against, what they would see as racialism, but really just a sense of yourself, of your own race, and of not being infinitely deferent to others in favor of universalism. And so another part of the Blairite post-1997 crusade is the introduction of hate crimes. And what's very interesting about that offense is that they are given this very explicit political and social engineering intent. And just to quote how Baroness Hale describes them in an interesting judgment in 2007, so a disabled man who's on a mobility scooter was going down the street after being at the pub, and he sees some Spanish women or some tourists on the pavement, and they're blocking him. And he gets...
Sooner or later, regardless of the Spanish women, right, we'll be seeing that merely going to the pub is going to be seen as a hate crime soon.
He's a bit annoyed about this, and he calls them bloody foreigners, and he tells them to go back home. And he is convicted of...
And you saw recently, who was it that said that David Lammy should go home? It was a Reform guy. I know it was a Reform guy. I would imagine we'll be seeing the whip withdrawn from him soon. Very sadly, because he speaks what a lot of British people are thinking.
Of a hate crime. But he says to the House of Lords Court of Appeal, well, this was not racism, because all he said was that they were foreigners. But Baroness Hale said that it was a hate crime, and that was because the intent of the hate crime...
Yeah, look at this face. Faces like this are the faces of Britain's destruction and feminization right here. Feminization hand in hand and often causing the destruction. No surprise.
Laws introduced by Blair was, quote, the mischiefs attacked by the aggravated versions of these offences are racism and xenophobia. And so the point there being that you have the law not just outlawing certain actions, but actually attacking mischiefs, attacking ideas, attacking beliefs, and therefore trying to rework society.
Yeah.
And it is social engineering. We saw that with the non-crime hate incidents that the government were trying to push. Yeah, how long did they last? They did not last very long. Obviously, they did not last very long. With like ridiculous legislation, like they were trying to criminalize conversations within people's homes at the dinner table if they were deemed to be hateful or racist or Islamophobic or whatever. No surprise, I believe that was being pushed through when it was either not long after Humza Yousaf's premiership as the First Minister of Scotland had finished, or when it was during his premiership, I can't remember. Seeing how dystopian and Orwellian this is getting, and it's a mark of the communist descent that our society is falling into.
And of course, the perfection of hate crime takes place under a Conservative government. The non-crime hate incident.
There we go. You just brought it up. And also think about it, ladies and gentlemen, all crimes are hate crimes if you think about it, because they hate for the law, they hate for the legislation, right? And that's why it matters that we get the legislation right. But yeah, the whole... Sorry, I thought it was raining. The whole hate crime thing, it's explicit politicization of the law in a partisan way, because people hate different things. That's the thing. Hate is a subjective emotion. You cannot have an objective standard based on a subjective emotion. It has to be objective wrongdoing. That's the whole thing. There's everything wrong with hate crimes is that it's based on subjective criteria, which the minute the establishment changes, the hate standard is going to change. So you cannot have... It's like having a ruler that constantly changes in length depending on who's holding it. You cannot have hate crime as an objective thing, because people don't hate the same thing. People don't hate the same thing.
Right, it's not even... You don't even have to have the crime. And again, and perhaps we should be drawing a conclusion on this, the way in which on so many cases that followed the Southport riots, you got judges declaring as a kind of statement of doctrine that we were a multicultural society, and that anything that challenged that was in fact a heresy, which, like real heresy, was a punishable crime. So people are going on at the moment about...
And that's what you see, and no matter how much these people claim to not care about religion, live and let live, all of this stuff, everyone will ultimately operate on a religious framework, right? Even the whole postmodernist thing where they're asserting what they are saying is the truth, even though they don't believe in truth, right? It all comes down to being a fundamentally religious framework. A lot of things will get down to these ideas when you drill down to their very, very roots, right? Because a lot of times the things where we base subjective morality in have to be outside of humanity. You can't really base anything, regarding objective morality inside of humanity, because humans are all different, and who's to say who's better than anyone else, right? Who's to say who's more valid than anyone else? Has to come from a standard higher than humans in that regard. But yeah, you're seeing here that I forgot what he said that was going to lead me on to my next point, because my dog is now pestering me because she needs to be fed. You can wait. The conversation's got like 5 minutes, Bill. You can wait. You're seeing there that I forgot my train of thought. I'm just going to let it play.
We mustn't have, Islamophobia. We mustn't have a crime of blasphemy.
Yeah, whole standard is blasphemy. Yeah, if you hate the wrong thing, but who's to define what hate is? That's the biggest thing. And you're seeing there that you need an authority bigger than government if you don't want to be then put into this kind of tyranny.
I think what we're both saying, Laurie, is that this new state has actually created a crime of blasphemy. It's called the hate crime, which is a crime against the noble lie of multiculturalism. Or indeed, many other things.
Make a note of that. Put that on your quote wall. Hate crimes are a crime against the noble lie of multiculturalism. That's one for the quote book. That's one for the quote wall.
Things as well. But the whole thing, it all knits together. The fundamental thing is universalism again. The belief, the moment you believe in a thing called universal human rights, you believe in a universal human being. Therefore, you believe that the nation state is merely provisional and is probably a bad thing, intervening between, you now and the utopia of a boundaryless world in which we will all be the same, and we will all live together as one huge happy family. And if you remember, it will be Corinthians 14, and the lion will lie down with the lamb, which is actually going to the book of Revelations, but there we are. And as we all know, this is nonsense. This is untrue. This is damning. This is dangerous. And if we're to survive, it's got to be undone.
Quite.
How many do you think are going to say, the whole thing where people say about communism, when they look to the Soviet Union, they look to Mao's China, they look to Cambodia, they look to all these other places, say that's not real communism? How much do you think people are going to say now that when they want to try and institute a system like this or keep shifting the goalposts to get away from the necessary conversations regarding this? Oh, that wasn't real multiculturalism. Oh, the rape gangs and the ethnic takeover and the ethno conflicts between like India and Pakistan, raising Pakistani flags over government buildings and other places in Britain. All of these things, that's not real multiculturalism. Right, and that's what David is getting down to. The point there is that in order for this to be truly rectified, it needs to be undone. It needs to be undone, right? I don't like using terminology like this. When you hear things like the Great Reset, it instantly puts things like into the mind of like the World Economic Forum, which is, globalist, communist in and of itself, right? So we don't want to go down that route. Because that's the whole source of the problem. That's the whole source of the problem, right? People who are motivated by that. But there needs to be, a reset on this whole thing, especially considering the British people never consented to it. In terms of how quickly their opinion and want changed. And the government said, fuck you, we're going to do it anyway. That's what the government said. And that's been going on now for nearly 100 years. And you wonder why people are so angry? You wonder why people are so angry? Like, not be angry when in the space of 100 years you've gone from a completely ethnically homogenous nation to now where 1 in 4 of your schools are minority of the native people. That's one example you can point to. But yeah, the noble lie, not so noble, needs to be undone. And you saw that, I don't know if you guys saw with the Anthony Joshua fight that come across my social media timeline recently. What flag did he walk out in pride? What flag did he walk out with? For those of you who don't know, it was the Nigerian flag. These people know. These people know. A lot of them may not have an understanding of the history, which is fair enough, right? But it does need to be undone. It does need to be undone. And for that, you need to go back to the very roots of when this first took place. That's why this conversation was so important, because that is, in large part, Windrush.
And just to toy with that a little more, I've actually just written something for Pimlico Journal on the Race Relations Act, and in particular the stirring up racial hatred offence. But what it seems to me that you have there, because this is in 1965, obviously after 20 years of significant Commonwealth immigration, and this is being brought in by a Labour government who are broadly in favour of this and at least seeming to try and defend it. But what they're writing into law there is this really draconian and broad provision against any kind of language that, as you say, might cut against universalism in some way, lest the public be stirred up to some kind of hatred. But the point...
The criminalisation of language. Before he gets onto this, the UK Race Relations Act, let me just give you a little bit of information on this. 1965, 1968 and 1976 were laws progressively outlawing racial discrimination in public places, employment, housing and services, making it illegal to treat people unfavourably due to colour, race, origin, and criminalising incitement to racial hatred, evolving to cover direct and indirect discrimination, and eventually consolidated into the broader Equality Act of 2010, which is why that Equality Act is so damaging. This was highlighted recently in a video highlighting that there was apparent discrimination between, in landlords, for example, that if you applied with the name, I believe it was Mohammed, and if you applied with the name Oliver, seemingly indicating that you were an Arab versus a white British person, that there would be, I think it was a 20% discrimination in favour of the white British person, right, which indicates an in-group preference. But I would also question the sample in that study. Well, it wasn't a study which they performed, but it was, an uncontrolled study, should we say, saying that, okay, what was the makeup of the landlords that you polled? I would imagine that if you polled landlords from other ethnic groups, as we've seen, they would be in favour of their own ethnic group or similar clusters of their own ethnic group, as we've seen in other examples that I believe I've covered in episodes prior. But yeah, the Race Relations Act has been revised in 1965, 68 and 76, outlawing racial discrimination in various forms, but then also in direct and indirect, which again is when you start getting into these weeds of what these terms mean.
They are actually implicitly making there is that the society this 20 years of immigration has so far created, that they have created, was inherently deeply liable to these kinds of tensions. And yet from that, they could not draw what might seem the obvious inference, which is that, well, we should stop continuing to create it. And you should say, okay, let's call a halt there, because clearly it's not working very well.
But of course, this is the standard policy, isn't it, of all of these revolutionary regimes we've talked about.
Thou shalt not
French,
offend.
The French Republican state, the French Revolutionary Republican state, of Hitler's Germany, of Stalin's Russia, of course, George Orwell's state. And the compulsion, you will remember, the boot on the human face. That all of these noble ideals fly so much in the face of human nature that the only way you can actually bring them about is by forms of suppression and criminal suppression, which is what we're doing now. And this seems to me to be it is the profound paradox of all of this stuff. It claims to liberate people, but it can only liberate them by incarcerating them. But once again, we on the right have so often gone along with this.
I don't know if you can see, I have a little interloper.
The whole Cameroon, and Theresa May is the one who stands on the steps of Downing Street and talks about burning injustice, burning racial injustice. She's the one who institutionalizes DEI in the civil service, and it's until, in other words, we can only properly tackle this if there is a genuine realization on the right that it is wrong, why it's wrong, and what needs to be done to put it right. The rest is for another debate. But I think until we get that, and I hope we've teased out a few of these points in the last hour or so, but I am increasingly convinced that what has gone wrong is as much.
Just before he gets onto that, for those of you who don't know, the quote that I can't remember if it was David or if the other guy was referring to, it's this quote from 1984. There will be no quote, there will be no curiosity, no enjoyment of the process of life. All competing pleasures will be destroyed. But always, do not forget this, Winston, always, there will be the intoxication of power, constantly increasing and constantly growing subtler. Always, at every moment, there will be the thrill of victory, the sensation of trampling on an enemy who is helpless. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. That is the kind of imagery and society, governance, all of these things that is being hinted at here, which I think if you were to ask most, at least British people in this instance, which I'm going to need to switch over to my BRB scene in a moment just before we finish out, because my dog has decided it's time to go ham on one of my slippers. That is the kind of thing which I think if you were to ask most British people at the moment, they would definitely be saying, oh yeah, that's what British society feels like. Criminalization of speech, criminalization of expression, criminalization of all different things that would be unheard of, you can just go back a few years ago, a few decades ago. That's the kind of imagery that we're invoking. Bear with me 2 seconds, ladies and gentlemen, and we'll be back. You little shit. Okay, sincere apologies, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know if you can hear me. Shit. I know you got the music going on as well. Hopefully you can hear me just about. Okay, right. Hello. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. As I was wrestling my slipper away from my dog, it only took me a few seconds. I had an important phone call come through that I had to attend to, so I apologize about that. We'll just get into the last part of this conversation now. But yeah, like I was saying, that conversation about British society and the imagery that it invokes, imagine a boot stomping on a human face forever, which I think, if you ask a lot of British people, that's exactly how they feel about their state of governance nowadays. There's not long left of this conversation. Let's finish it off. Oh, bear with. I'm just going to check the chat as well. Okay, so my last thing was in the chat. Okay, here we go.
Much on the right as it is on the left. The fact that the Cameronism and, of course, the whole world of the neocons in America all bought into this stuff. This is what's given it its universal purchase. It's got to stop.
Absolutely. And of course, we shouldn't forget that the setting of 1984, Airstrip 1, is actually Britain.
Indeed.
Okay, well, David Starkey,
go.
thank you very much for coming on The Skeptic.
A great pleasure.
And there we go. That's the end of the conversation. For the most part, there is the next part then is like a trailer for like their next conversation or whatever it is. I just want to see if I can do something in the YouTube chat. A moment. Just see if I can do this. What? I've never done this before in the YouTube chat, so I just want to see if this works. I think hopefully this should work. It might not. I should have just asked the question in the chat, but I'm not sure if it works the way that I think it might have. I wanted to basically ask what your biggest takeaways were. I don't think it's actually going to work with the chat thing, with the question thing that I've laid out. But yeah, that's it for the conversation about obviously the Windrush myth in particular was more so centered around the first part of the conversation. So in terms of the actual conversation itself, if you want to go back and rewatch this, I'm not sure what the exact timestamps would be. Is the, where is it? Chapters. So if you want to go back and rewatch the conversation, they have it split into different chapters, but you can go and find on, I'll put the link in the, I'll put the link in the chat as well. This is the link to the actual conversation. Link to conversation. There we go. So that's in the chat as well. If you want to go and watch this yourself, the timestamps, you'll be able to find them, but we have in this instance now from 136 to 1929 is the conversation on the lies of multiculturalism, Windrush, the myth, all things like that. The disastrous budget then from 1929 to 4118. From 4118 then to 4942, you have the Sinister Perec report. We talked about the Bikari Perec or whatever his name was. The Indian guy that seems to be pushing through a lot of this stuff through the academic institutions and stuff like that. Hate crimes equals social engineering from 4942 to 5654. And that's where then the conversation ends. So I just want to leave it open to you guys now to a little bit of time to have a little bit of a discussion around these things. If you want to leave it in the chat and stuff like that, your biggest takeaways, if you enjoyed it, if you didn't, or whatever. What was the biggest thing that either you learned, you didn't, in terms of most of them maybe added information to what you already knew, or those kinds of things. Please leave them in the chat. I'll just stay on for about another 5 minutes or so, you know, to go over some of the things. I don't think this Q&A thing is exactly working. But yeah, just want to know your biggest takeaways. Just want to know your biggest takeaways from this point onwards. I'll link as well, just while I'm here, if there's anybody actually still here. I'll link as well from, what was he, man? Bear with, right, okay. So, let me go over to my channel. Couple of things that I'd appreciate you checking out. This is, if you want to know about the myth around the Black Briton and the lies around that, you can be able to find that here. First Black Briton clip. This is from the most recent podcast that I've done, so that's in the chat now as well. The full episode, which premiered earlier on today, it's about 2 hours long, can be found here. Full TV #84. There we are. Put those in the chat as well. So if you want to go over and listen to those, obviously the thing I do as well, guys, with the podcasts, with the political commentary and stuff like that, is that there's chapters in the descriptions as well. If there's a particular section you want to skip to, use those chapters as well. I appreciate a lot of the times I can go quite long with a lot of my rambly, you know, commentary bits and stuff like that. So some of the episodes I've done are like 2 hours and 20 minutes or whatever. But if there's a particular section that you think would be quite interesting that comes later on, use the chapters outside of the live preview on YouTube. So on Rumble, on Spotify, on Amazon Music, on Audible, on those things, you should be able to skip the specific points if you want to listen to those things and get your rundown on those kinds of things as well. So make sure you do that. Anything in the chat or whatever? Let's just make sure it's on live chat, not just top chat. There we are. Yeah, what was your biggest takeaways? What was your biggest takeaways from this conversation? I thought it was pretty interesting to get an insight onto the myths of Windrush and stuff like that. A lot of then avenues we can talk about with political commentary in the modern day. The agitators, in particular the foreign agitators, which seem to pose a lot of influence with regards to the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, proposing racial motivations when maybe they weren't actually racial motivations. The gang at the time, they weren't actually specifically targeting black people, it would seem. They terrorized white people as well. So there's a lot of history that needs untangling. The myth around that they were brought in to bring up labor shortages and stuff like that when there really were none. What was the biggest thing that you found most interesting? I'll give it about another 2 minutes or so. I appreciate there's a little bit of a delay from when I'm speaking this and when you guys are going to be hearing it. Just set a little bit of a timer. So what's the stream on? Stream at the moment is on 2 hours and 41 minutes. Otherwise, guys, if you've decided to bow out, thank you very much for tuning in. I greatly appreciate it. I really, really greatly appreciate it. I hope you found it useful. Hope you enjoyed it, obviously. Hope you continue to enjoy the political commentary and content that comes from not only this channel, but on all the other platforms as well. It's extremely important that at least people are exposed to different political opinions, especially going into what could be the most pivotal election in Wales of our lifetime next year. If some of you are already still here that have not bowed out yet, I appreciate you for tuning in. If you are going to bow out soon, I hope you have a very... I'm doing a double salute here for some reason. Single salute. I hope you have a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. If I don't tune in with you and see you before then, maybe we can schedule another stream if I find a conversation that is quite interesting and stuff like that to go through. But I thought this one was particularly interesting. Windrush is a time when people say... a lot of things went wrong, right? So it's important to go back and revisit those roots as well of when people think a lot of these things went wrong. So yeah, got about a minute and a half if I don't hear anything before. But what we got? Thank you about that. Cheers, Ian. Thank you very much. I greatly appreciate it. If you're bowing out, good sir, hope you have a very Merry Christmas. And if I don't see you or hear from you before, a very Happy New Year to you. A very, very Happy New Year to you indeed. If anybody has any whiskey recommendations, please leave them. I'm going to need some because with the fatigue that I have of talking about political issues... Put a great decent whiskey on my Christmas list for Santa this year to deal with the fatigue. So if you have any, please do let me know. I don't know why I'm doing this. But yeah, to cope with the fatigue and to cope with the different things that are going on, particularly in the UK political space at the moment, it's definitely something which... I put on my Christmas list as a matter of priority. In addition to my favorite kind of Cubans, the ones you put inside a little bit of brown paper and stretch out into a thin line and put a lighter on and inhale, right? That's a joke. That's a joke. YouTube, that's a joke. You can't tell. I'm a little bit happy. I'm a little bit happy right now. But we did go and get some... a little tradition that we have. Oh, there we go. My time is done. We do have a little bit of a tradition around Christmas and birthdays and stuff like that. We like to have a cigar, right? So that's the joke about those favorite kinds of Cubans, right? I was debating lighting one up on here, but I don't know. Thought that it'd be so much I like to share with my girlfriend. Don't spoil a good malt. What's a good malt? What's a good malt? Please tell me. Please tell me. I'm always broadening my horizons. I'm at that I'm at that point where like I'm experimenting. I'm a whore for whiskey at the moment. I can't believe I just said that. I'm a bit of a whore for whiskey at the moment. So any recommendations so far? I've tried pretty much all the Pandarians, aside from one which I found recently that I didn't even know existed. Right, so I'm hopefully going to try that very soon. But it was very expensive when I was going to buy it from the place where I found it, so I did not end up getting it in the end. Tried all the Pandarians. I've tried Johnny Walker Black Label. I've tried the Famous Grouse, which is what this is, which is quite nice. But let me know if you're acquainted. Help a brother out. I'll leave it around for 1 or 2 minutes now in case you happen to put something in the chat. But yeah, definitely put whiskey or some other kind of strong spirit on my Christmas list to deal with the fatigue and to deal with the news headlines that you see coming out of the UK very, very often, because it is very, very depressing. Joe, are you still there, my friend? Joe, you still there, my friend? I don't know if Joe's gone. But yeah, as I said, those of you who are starting to tune out or whatever, thank you very much for tuning in. I greatly appreciate it. Wishing you a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, obviously. And yeah, I wish I looked like this. Let me see if I can. Let me switch over to OBS. I wish this is my. That's my total Christmas t-shirt. That's my total Christmas t-shirt. Because I have yet to acquire a Santa hat. So maybe we can do another stream, maybe before Christmas, maybe after, where we could be full on total Christmas. But we do indeed have our Christmas tree and everything up there, and the haunted satanic elf that's clinging onto the Christmas tree that terrorizes us, which my mother decided to put up for some good reason, for some apparent good reason anyway. Royal Blackler. I've never heard of it. Never heard of it. Is it in Tesco? Is it in Tesco? That's my biggest question. Or will I need to go to somewhere else to get it? But yeah, because the thing is, I found this with spirits as well. This is a completely off-topic conversation now. I found it with spirits as well that, you know, there's so many different types of gins and so many different types of vodka and so many different types of all of these different spirits, rums, the lot. If you're trying to get into something, it can be so difficult to find where to start. It can be so difficult to find where to start, especially when you see how some of the expensive higher end ones get. You know, you're looking at like Johnny Walker Blue Label and stuff like that. It can be very, very expensive, it seems. But yeah, all different types as well. Bourbon versus single malt versus blended versus double distilled, triple distilled. It's like, it's an entire craft in and of itself, you know. 1,000! 1,000! You what? You fucking what? I mean, fair play. Fair play. I have to have a look into it when I'm... Yeah, no, I'm going to be able to get that, unfortunately. I'm stuck with the Tesco. I'm stuck with the Tesco range, guys. I'm stuck with the Tesco range. Let's keep it within the price range. Oh, good God. Good God. But hey, if you could set up something which gives you like, I don't know if it's like £1,000 a bottle or whatever it is, right? That's an industry I need to get into. So, yeah. Maybe we can do like a VOTV branded whiskey in the future, but not make it shit like some of the other celebrity whiskeys are. Make sure it's actually like good product and stuff like that. But because certainly a lot of people need it to get through the political landscape the way that it is. When you're in the old country, we will treat you. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. I'll certainly would be very appreciative. Thank you ever so much. I have the best people in my chat. What can I say? I have the best people in my chat. All right, well, it is quarter past 10 in the evening here in the socialist utopia airstrip 1 known as the UK. And this has been a David Starkey watch party / review of his conversation with the Daily Skeptic. I believe it's just known as the Skeptic now, if I'm not mistaken. Let me just make sure that's correct. David Starkey on the Daily Skeptic on the lies of multiculturalism, the Windrush myth, and all manner of other political issues. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. Hope you guys found it useful, right? And hope you guys will add to the political discourse afterwards in the comments as well. So the live chat has obviously been during the live chat and stuff like that, but you guys will have during the time where this is now going to be going on to video on demand, the VOD, to watch this back in real time, right? To watch this back on demand, I should say, and actually be able to skip to the relevant sections and whatever, and watch this at your own convenience. In which case, I hope you leave your thoughts down in the comments and whatever. Particularly if you guys have anything to add to the conversation, even if it is in contradiction or contrary to the ideas that are proposed, and you have evidence to support those things, those things will be beneficial to everybody in terms of debate, in terms of productive conversation. Anything you guys want to add, leave them down in the comments as well. And thank you to everybody that's tuned in on this live as well. I greatly appreciate it. And I hope you guys found it useful, and I hope you enjoyed it. Now we're going to leave it there. So thank you very much for watching and listening, ladies and gentlemen, watching and or listening. I greatly appreciate it. If I don't catch up with you guys before Christmas and the New Year, I hope you guys have a fantastic Christmas and New Year. Very, very, very merry one indeed. And have a tremendous one. There'll certainly be more episodes coming out between now and Christmas and New Year, I would imagine. But until then, have a fantastic morning, afternoon, evening, night, wherever you are. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you for watching. Hwyl fawr. We'll see you next time. And you take care of yourselves now. You take very, very good care of yourselves now. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year. Take care.